Hey, the month of September is already here, so let's dive into some of the major themes and moments of the month ahead. The most significant thing that's happening during the month of September are the eclipses taking place in the sign of Virgo and Pisces. But before we get into that, I want to discuss the landscape of the month leading into September. For the past few months or so, we've had this configuration where the outer planets Uranus, Pluto, Neptune, and Saturn as well are forming the head of a Grand Kite. Now, a Grand Kite is formed whenever you have two sextiles, which also form a trine between the two bases. And to complete the Grand Kite, we would need a trine forming from Uranus and Pluto down to something here in Libra, which will happen at some point in the month of September. But before we even get there, we kind of have to discuss what this configuration of outer planets even means. Now, mind you, these are outer planets, so unless if they're hitting your chart in a really specific way, you might not be feeling this so much in your day-to-day life. This is more of one of those transits that just sets the stage or sets the themes for what's happening in society. Starting with this trine between Uranus and Pluto, Uranus and Pluto are both at very early degrees of air signs. Uranus in Gemini, Pluto in Aquarius. We usually see large dramatic changes to the structures of power with Pluto and Aquarius, as well as innovations and revolutions, specifically in the realms of science and technology. And as far as Uranus and Gemini goes, it provides a lot of innovations to our technology as well, specifically communication systems. The last generation of people who were born with Uranus and Gemini were these titans of media. Think the Clintons, think Cher, think Jimi Hendrix. These individuals largely shaped the way we look at modern news, communication, and pop culture today, especially in terms of how they shaped media like television. So both of these outer planets, Uranus and Pluto, are working together to bring high levels of change at a pretty rapid pace. One of the most prominent ways that many astrologers have pointed out is the rise of artificial intelligence. But it doesn't just stop there, especially with Uranus and Gemini. Uranus rules things like disruptions, unexpected noise, communication out of left field, and in the sign of Gemini, it moves lightning fast. One of the things that I've been thinking of specifically with Uranus and Gemini is how easy it is to get lost in the sauce, especially with the amount of information we're being fed at any given moment. I often think of Uranus and Gemini kind of like a Sherlock Holmes kind of transit, specifically because the author of Sherlock Holmes was a Gemini rising with Uranus and Gemini. And that gives us a different lens of interpretation when I think about Gemini, because if you think of the way a detective works, it's very Gemini. It doesn't try to derive meaning from things on a hunch. It wants to follow the clues and consolidate the data into something that makes sense where all of the pieces fit together. If you ever want to go to an escape room, bring a Gemini. So with Uranus here, it's kind of like we're being bombarded with a lot of clues and a lot of pieces. And not all of these pieces of information are relevant, and certainly misinformation has been at an all-time high. We've been left to put together the pieces of what information is true, what information is relevant, and more importantly, what information is even helpful. So think of this trine as like a free flow of energy moving between that Uranus placement and Pluto. Now, both of them are forming sextiles to Saturn and Neptune in the sign of Aries. Both Saturn and Neptune are going to eventually move back into Pisces, and in fact, Saturn moves into Pisces literally on September 1st. However, even at 29 degrees of Pisces, Saturn is still going to be impacted by Uranus and Pluto. Really, a sextile is like an opportunity for this slower moving planet to enhance the capabilities of a faster moving planet. With Neptune and Saturn conjunct in the sign of Aries, that puts these two as the receiver of that energy, specifically the Saturn. So these two planets really become the focal point. And what this means societally for us is a lot different than how it may show up for you in your personal chart, especially if you have planets in any of the early degrees of most of the signs. There's probably something in this configuration that's hitting your chart. But the combination of Neptune and Saturn together in the sign of Aries is slightly uncomfortable. In some way, it could feel like our collective action is being debilitated in some way. For many of us, this could be about not having a clear sense of direction right now. I do think on many levels, though, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction is going to spark a lot of creativity in the long run, especially when you think of art as a political statement. Aries is a major force of creativity. And if we look at some of the positive potentials of these two energies, Saturn asks us to take things seriously, and Neptune asks us to lean into our dreams, our fantasies, our creativity, and our spirituality. So this combination of Uranus, Pluto, Saturn, and Neptune is really creating a potent ecosystem for us to be able to find new creative solutions to the problems that we're facing. And in my opinion, it's also asking us to get really serious about our systems of belief. Traditional forms of religion are experiencing a lot of backlash because they're not necessarily conforming to the cultural needs of today. When people feel disenfranchised from their spirituality, it does have implications in our creativity and our cultural understanding of how we connect and unite. So I think culturally, this echo chamber, which isn't really going away, is a really great opportunity for us to start getting a plan of attack together, as opposed to just reacting to everything that Uranus and Gemini and Pluto and Aquarius are bringing. Now, moving on, during the month of September, we are going to have planets moving into new signs. On September 1st, while it's retrograde, Saturn moves into Pisces, and that retrograde is going to take it all the way back to the 25th degree of Pisces. It'll start moving direct again on November 27th, and it'll move back into Aries on February 13th. So we're going to have quite a bit of time with it in the sign of Pisces again. And again, I do think this is going to be a little bit easier of an energy for Saturn because in Pisces, it doesn't so egregiously stop us from taking action like it does when it's in Aries. Saturn in Pisces can feel very isolating. It kind of asks us to relearn what our place in the world is and shows us whether or not we feel connected to the other humans that are around us. But a lot of its themes happen on a more subconscious level rather than a practical, tangible, and literal level. Obviously, that's going to be impacted by your own chart, and you want to pay attention to what's happening in your own chart. And for those of you who have Saturn in Pisces and went through your Saturn return, especially if your Saturn is between 20 to 29 degrees of Pisces, yeah, this could feel like a second Saturn return for you. During September anyways, Saturn will be moving from 29 degrees of Pisces back to about 27 degrees of Pisces. So if you have planets in those later degrees of the water signs or the mutable signs, I would start paying closer attention to them and see what's happening for you and where it lands in your own chart. Then around September 5th, September 6th, depending on your time zone, Uranus is going to go retrograde in Gemini. This is a slow mover and shouldn't dramatically change any interpretation of what Gemini is doing, at least in your personal chart. In fact, by the end of September, it hasn't even moved a full degree yet, so we're going to be experiencing that Uranus in Gemini for a while longer. Now, we also have personal planets changing signs in the month of September as well. Mercury moves into Virgo on September 2nd, and it is going to breeze through the sign of Virgo very quickly and move into Libra on September 18th, with a Mercury cazimi taking place on September 13th. As the ruler of Virgo, that does mean that Mercury will be the ruler of the solar eclipse taking place on the 21st. But we will get into those eclipses later. Now, whatever houses Mercury is moving into in your own chart, I would just start paying conscious attention to some of the ideas and themes that are coming up, especially with that Mercury cazimi taking place in Virgo. Find where Virgo is in your chart and start brainstorming some new ideas or thinking about that area of life a little more critically. Mercury is there to help you find the devil in the details and to help you get really clear about how all of the small details in your life are adding up to make a bigger picture. And then when it moves into Libra, it's going to immediately form the tail of that Grand Kite we were talking about between the outer planets. You can see that represented right here, this green kite shape that's happening. So that Mercury in Libra moment on the 18th can be pretty impactful for you, especially when it comes to learning how to share your ideas, your beliefs, and your thoughts with others, especially if they disagree with you. Mercury will end the month of September at 20 degrees of Libra, so we will be seeing it move into Scorpio come October. Now, Venus is also going to be changing signs during the month of September. It's starting off at 8 degrees of Leo. It's a really great energy for diving into authentic self-expression, and by September 19th, it will change signs into Virgo. As it moves signs into Virgo, it's going to be accompanied by the moon, which will be bracing and preparing itself for the Virgo eclipse, and it's also going to be squaring Uranus and Gemini. So on a societal level, I'm very curious to see how this plays out, especially since Venus traditionally has a harder time in the sign of Virgo. I'm specifically curious to see what the news cycle looks around this time. And look, you guys know how it goes. News doesn't happen right in the moment that it's announced, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get some larger revelations about what's been going on beneath the surface on this day, especially since the moon is involved, and Venus in Virgo is very good at peeking into the fine details where Uranus and Gemini might just want to glance over them. I would pay special attention to Venus in Virgo if you are a Libra or Taurus rising, or if you have placements at the early degrees of the mutable signs Virgo, Gemini, Pisces, and Sagittarius. By the end of the month, Venus will be getting closer to a South Node conjunction at 13 degrees of Virgo. So by the time we get into October, you can start preparing for a Venus South Node conjunction. Now, the last major moment of sign changes is taking place on September 22nd when the Sun enters Libra and Mars enters Scorpio. One of my favorite things to do when the Sun enters a new sign or new house in your chart is to pay attention to the themes of that house and make that like your spring cleaning moment of that house theme. And the Sun in Libra does mean fall is officially here, so grab your sweaters and get ready for some cooler weather. Now, Mars, for the majority of September, is going to be in Libra, which it doesn't traditionally do too hot in. I personally have Mars in Libra, and I just consider that it makes me a petty bitch. But Mars in Libra is really good for the energy of diplomacy and negotiation. And you can see how that sort of contradicts with the traditional function of Mars, since Mars wants forward action. It doesn't want to sit around and talk about the thing. It wants to do the thing. So when Mars enters Scorpio on the 22nd, it's going to be a really great energy and revitalization of Mars, with Mars ruling over the sign of Scorpio. With Mars in Scorpio, I like to think of that as protecting the babies. It's really good at defensive and strategic maneuvering, and it's really great at understanding the motivations of other people. By the end of September, Mars will have entered 5 degrees of Scorpio. So if you are an Aries or Scorpio rising, I would pay attention to what it's doing in your chart around that time. And if you have placements in any of the fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, especially in the early degrees, I would start to track what's happening for you around the end of September. So with all of that being said, we can now finally start moving into the eclipses and what they represent for us collectively and for you in your individual chart. Now, in my personal practice, I look at the eclipses as fated moments or events, and I don't just look at the specific days that eclipses are happening, but I really think of the 2-week portal between the eclipses as a window of a lot of change and transformation in our lives. For this first eclipse we're having on September 7th, it's going to be a lunar eclipse in the sign of Pisces. That lunar eclipse period is a really great moment for you to understand what subconscious patterns are trying to rise to the surface for you. And it's ruled by Jupiter, which is currently sitting in its exaltation in Cancer. Now, I know people say that eclipses can be pretty hectic, but I love working with eclipses. I got my first astrology gig during an eclipse. I quit my full-time job during an eclipse. And look, to each their own. If you don't want to mess with that, I don't blame you. But I do really love this trine to Jupiter that's happening. Pisces is a mutable energy. Its energy is scattered in all directions. But with the lunar eclipse being ruled by Jupiter in Cancer, a cardinal sign, feels like around this point in time, collectively, we should have a stronger gut feeling on where we want to go and the type of things that we want to do. Now, on this day, Jupiter is squaring Mars in Libra. So maybe one of the real challenges during this eclipse could be getting clear with others about the direction you want to take. But the theme that I would give to this lunar eclipse is emotional clarity. If there's something that's been needing to change or end, or if you've been looking to make a transition of some kind, this lunar eclipse could be really helpful for that. Now, I'd really pay attention to wherever Pisces and Cancer are in your chart, and any planets that you might have around that like 17 to 20 degree mark in any of the signs. Those planets in your chart could add or change the theme of this eclipse for you personally. But really, the most attention I would pay is to where Cancer and Pisces fall in terms of houses in your chart, especially because Jupiter in Cancer is ruling over Pisces and the moon in Pisces is ruling over Cancer. So there's a lot of back and forth interactions happening between those two signs. Then the solar eclipse will be taking place on September 21st. This will be our second new moon in the sign of Virgo this year. So it might be helpful for you to look at what was going on around August 23rd or what sort of plans you are making around that time period. It's taking place right at the 29th degree, and it's going to touch down at a very close trine to Pluto in Aquarius, Uranus in Gemini, and that Saturn-Neptune conjunction, at this point taking place between Saturn in Pisces and Neptune in Aries. Now, solar eclipses typically manifest as more outward-facing events, and with as many outer planets that are involved in this formation, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some sort of bigger news headline around this time period. We've already kind of discussed that whenever anything is entering this Libra-Virgo zone right now, it's going to be forming a grand trine between these outer planets. So in this case, I'm also very interested to what's happening with Saturn and Neptune in this moment. When you have a Grand Kite that's being powered by an eclipse, that is something significant and worth paying attention to. So if we have any curiosity around how Saturn and Neptune are showing up for us or in the world right now, the eclipse on September 21st is going to be a really great window for understanding what's going on and how it's impacting us. Now, since the eclipse is taking place in the sign of Virgo, it's going to be ruled by Mercury. And in this case, we have Mercury not far ahead of the eclipse, just at 5 degrees of Libra. And again, it's forming a pretty close trine to Pluto, Uranus, and Pallas Athena here. So for the 21st, I would pay really close attention to that Virgo-Pisces axis in your chart. There can be more outward-facing revelations about how the rest of the year is going to go or how things are going to change for you over the course of September, specifically by looking at the houses that are impacted by this transit. And also, don't ignore the house that Mercury is in as well. That can come into play for you. And that, my friends, is the month of September in a nutshell. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about what's going on, drop it down in the comments below. My name is Moses. I'm an astrologer based in Denver, Colorado, and I will see you next month.